Welcome to The Story Behind the Symptoms, a podcast from symptomatic.me. Your host is David Clark, MD, a board-certified gastroenterologist who successfully diagnosed and treated over 7,000 patients with neuroplastic pain or illness. Each episode, we dive into our guests' life experiences to uncover the deeper causes of their symptoms. By listening to their story, you will gain insights that advance your own journey towards knowledge that becomes healing.
Hello, my name is Dr. David Clark. I'm the president of the Association for Treatment of Neuroplastic Symptoms. Welcome to the Story Behind the Symptoms podcast, where I am going to interview a person who has suffered from neuroplastic symptoms and try to understand where those symptoms came from and how we can help people successfully recover from them. And my guest today is Ben Savoy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And
that's correct.
We've never met before, so we're going to start from ground zero, the way I would with a patient in my office, for example. Although this is not a medical evaluation and it's not therapy, it's just a conversation trying to understand, as the title of the podcast implies, that what the story is behind the symptoms. So Ben, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll get rolling.
Yeah, my name is Ben, and I have a long history actually in this modality and in this world, but only recently have come to understand it. I spent most of my life kind of in the dark, and recently found a lot more than I ever thought I would. So it's an exciting time in a way.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you found this approach and that you've made progress with it. Where I usually start is the same place the symptoms started. Approximately how old were you and what was going on at that time?
Yeah, so I've thought about this part a lot, and I don't have a great memory of my childhood for a lot of reasons. And I do know, piecing things together, that when I was about 6 years old, I think what happened, I got a really bad case of food poisoning or stomach flu. And instead of it going away, once I got better, it just stayed for a really long time. From 6 years old until a year ago, I'm now 33, I had variations of intense symptoms that are related to that very first experience. But then there's also others that came later in life, many years later. But the origin was around 6 years old, and my life kind of spiraled from that. Before that, as far as I know, I had a pretty normal childhood up until 6.
Okay, and you developed other symptoms after that. Maybe we can talk about some of the other symptoms that you experienced.
Yeah, so basically from 6 until I was 15, I had just had all kinds of extreme nausea, gut issues, food intolerances, acid reflux and GERD, and all kinds of things, extreme fatigue. And then when I turned 15 or 16, I was actually helping this is actually interesting, I was helping move boxes when my parents were getting divorced. So I was moving boxes out of our house that I was going to be moving out of to live with my mother. And while I was moving, I noticed a pain in my back, in my lower back. And it was the first time I'd ever really felt I didn't really know what back pain was. It just wasn't something I'd ever thought about. And it was a burning sensation. I remember feeling it all day. And from then on, it started a long journey of chronic back and body pain that developed to more and more extremes over time. And that was kind of the genesis of the chronic back pain. So I kind of have two main neuroplastic, areas of focus: the gut stuff and the back stuff.
Okay, yeah, that's not going to come as a surprise to many people who've been through this, that you can have symptoms in more than one place in the body at the same time. That's one of the characteristics of neuroplastic symptoms that distinguishes it from other forms of illness or injury. Typically with an organ disease or structural damage, it'll be confined to areas in and around or at least affected by that particular organ or injury. But in neuroplastic symptoms, the brain sends its nerves out everywhere, and so you can have symptoms literally from head to toe and in more than one location at a time. My personal record patient came in with a printout from the internet that listed a whole bunch of symptoms that supposedly were attributed to chronic yeast infection. They were no such thing, but that was what the list was. And he had circled 27 different distinct symptoms that he personally was suffering from at that moment. And they were all successfully treated, and in his case, fortunately, were gone in about a month, just by addressing the main underlying issue for him. So I'm gathering that you eventually found a successful approach to the very long-lasting symptoms that you had. How did you find the approach that worked for you, and what were the salient characteristics of the ideas that helped you the most?
Yeah, so, being someone who had been in chronic pain and illness for virtually my whole life, I was always looking for the next new thing to try, the next hope to hold on to. I'll say the one thing that, just never giving up is probably the best thing I could have ever done, because there's so many times where I just felt like I was going to be like this for the rest of my life. Like there's no chance I'll find a way out, but I never gave up. So I would often go down long roads of looking for things that seemed promising, but then finding out that they were not the answer. And one day I was actually I started working at an office job for the first time, where I had to sit in a chair a lot, and sitting in the chair was like my worst nightmare, because I could never sit in a chair comfortably. A couch maybe, but a chair was like, it just always made me so uncomfortable and feel so much pain. So I was researching chronic pain a lot, like back pain, and I came across, actually, I think originally what I came across was a YouTube video of Nicole Sachs from Journal Speak, and I didn't actually look too deep into her until later, but what triggered me originally was hearing her talk about John Sarno. And so I was really interested in what she was saying. Like it's kind of clicked with me in a way. And so I bought the Mind Body prescription book. And I just, at that point I just basically had the most open mind, and also was highly skeptical, which I think was actually a big part later of why I improved a lot, because I had gotten to a point where I was open enough and skeptical enough of everything that I could actually let go of some things. And so I essentially read that book, and there's a term I think people have said called a book cure, where
Yes.
just the information itself can make a big difference. So as I was reading the book, I started to kind of really absorb it and implement a lot of the ideas behind it into my daily way of thinking. It was the first time where I was really blown away in a way that seemed like, oh, this actually might be what it is, because I connected to so many parts of the personality features and, kind of the obsessive focus on the pain and on the things that I'm trying to fix. And I'm a huge repressor. So like the repression is a huge thing. So essentially, I read that book and I began, which I know now would be called cognitive soothing, but at the time it was a natural thing I just started to implement, where I would kind of tell myself, actually would say over and over to myself, these symptoms there's nothing physically wrong with you. These symptoms are not needed. And I would just say that over and over, and I would just kind of start letting go of everything I was doing that had to do with treating myself or keeping me in the confines of a diagnosis. And I was eating anything I wanted, and I was like, okay, the worst that could happen is I'll feel really sick, but I feel really sick all the time, so it's not going to be anything new. So I was like, might as well just, let it all go and see what happens. And I'd say after reading the book in about a few weeks, in that month, I'd say I reduced all of my symptoms by 50%, which was more than I've ever done in my entire life in any scenario, no matter what I'd done. I mean, I've been to 20 plus doctors and specialists, and that made more of a difference than anything I've ever done.
Yeah, that's pretty convincing that you were on the right track when you see results like that.
Yeah, I mean, it was very shocking in a way, but it made me very sure that I was on the right path. And I have I guess a theory. I think a lot of people who have only experienced some neuroplastic symptoms for like a few years maybe wouldn't need to go as deep as I ended up having to go after that point, because I think when I did the work of just changing the way my brain thought about my pain, I kind of unleashed a slew of things that I've been repressing my entire life. And at that point, my physical symptoms were completely replaced with basically anxiety, depression, and all kinds of things that I've basically done everything I could to possibly not face for my entire life. And so all of a sudden I found myself having zero. There were times where I actually had zero physical symptoms, but I felt the most mental despair that I've ever felt in my entire life. So it was like a trade-off. Like I opened the wound.
Extremely paradoxical that at a moment when you should have been joyful that you were finally freed of physical pain, the opposite was occurring. And, this is a very good description of what happens with what we call pain reprocessing therapy. Help people to understand that it's not their body that is responsible for the symptoms, and that we want to shift your attention to what's happening in the brain and start thinking about why the brain might be reacting this way, what it could be in your life, past or present, that is causing the brain to do this to your body. Another way I express it is that your brain is actually using the symptoms to communicate its distress to you, that there is something that it is, profoundly distressed or unhappy about, but it isn't able to communicate it to you consciously, so it instead is communicating it to you via your body, and just trying to, bang on the walls of your skull from the inside and say, we got something we're not content with here, and try to get you to pay attention to that. But that's what pain reprocessing therapy does, is it shifts your attention from the body to where the real problem is. And it isn't unusual for people to, at least mentally and sometimes physically, take a step backwards in their healing journey, to find themselves, temporarily with even more symptoms at times, or to have mental health symptoms come into play. And Dr. Sarno used to call this the symptom imperative, that you would alleviate one symptom and something else would take its place. It's not a term that I'm in favor of, because it kind of implies that you can never get out of this loop. But it turns out that if you identify the real causes, identify the issues that you've been repressing, as you so well expressed it, that the symptom imperative is no longer imperative once you do that, and that people can get out of this cycle of old symptoms coming back or new symptoms coming on. So I'm very interested in your journey from that point. Your physical symptoms have improved, but now you're confronted with anxiety and depression, which for some people can be even worse. What happened from then?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I think it's often worse. I remember John Sarno talking about how the brain fears mental pain more than physical pain. I don't know if it was in that book, but I remember hearing someone say, like, it's much more likely someone will, jump off a bridge out of mental pain than physical pain. Like, the mental pain, I think, is, for whatever reason, it does seem to be the thing that's a lot harder to deal with. And the symptom imperative thing, it's funny because my whole life, it's like if one thing gets better, something gets worse, and I think that's probably a very common story with neuroplastic, people who have disorders with neuroplastic symptoms. It's even to this day, it's true. So it's really fascinating how you can notice it in real time, even with so much awareness of what's going on. But where
Yeah,
I'm,
Nicole Sachs is often quoted with her brief assessment of that, which is that neuroplastic symptoms are a form of having something that hurts in preference to something that hurts worse.
yes. Yeah, like like being comfortable in your misery, there's something to that for
And
sure.
better than being even more uncomfortable in even worse misery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always a distraction is kind of what it feels like. Like it's trying to keep you from something that's deeper. And so, yeah, so I basically got to a point, and this I would say was 6 months to a year ago when I was really deep in that part of my life where I was now having to deal with all this mental health stuff. And like I couldn't celebrate it at all. It was actually, like you said, it was really wild because I'd waited for that moment my entire life. I basically didn't even think it was possible. And then I get there and I feel kind of the worst I've ever felt in a way, but I also feel like it's kind of like in the end a beautiful necessary thing because I was facing things I think that needed to be processed that were never able to come out.
Yeah, and I think also I could make the case that your brain had been working on this in the background your entire life, and that you reached a point at age 31 you were finally ready to face these things. And it takes people sometimes a very long time before they reach that point. It's just a measure of the magnitude of the level of stress that you have to deal with. I make the analogy with a lot of my patients that they are resembling Olympic weightlifters who are being asked to carry 50 pounds more than the world record for their weight class. They're not going to feel very good. They're going to feel weak. They're going to be in pain. And if they're not recognizing how much weight they're carrying, they're going to be wondering, what in the world is going on. But when you finally see that the weight is there, and sometime after that are able to gain the ability to put the weight down, then you realize the strength that you've had all along.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it's interesting to know what you're capable of enduring. And I think having been through so much for so long, suffering was something that was just normal to me. So when I was no longer suffering, I almost felt like I didn't know what to do, like how to be. So it's almost like my brain needed to find something to make me suffer. In a way, like it was uncomfortable in a strange way.
Yeah, if you've been a weightlifter all your life and now all of a sudden you don't have to lift weights, it's like, what do I do now?
Yeah, who am I? I used to identify so much with being sick and being in pain because it was a coping mechanism. I would basically look at it as like, well, this makes something about me. I can use this as an advantage. I used to always be like, this is kind of like my superpower because it makes me have more insight on pain, or maybe it makes me understand other people better who are in suffering. I used to try and always, make it a part of who I am just to be able to come to terms with the scenario. And later, after essentially what I did was I just went all in. I was like, okay, I'm going to go all in on focusing on mental health and trying to deal with whatever all this stuff is that I've never dealt with. And I feel like I'm now kind of on the other side of that somewhat. And it took a lot of work, but I knew that it was like, the best thing about it is, when you're really sick forever, people with these symptoms too know that you're always looking for a diagnosis. You're always looking for, what can you tell me that's wrong that I can work on? And so many times that causes more problems than it solves in the neuroplastic world, it seems.
Yeah,
But
body focused.
yeah, because I used to be desperate for a diagnosis for many times in my life. I remember going to the ER once and I said, "Can you just tell me I have something?" And the guy was like, "You don't want anything. What do you mean?" And I was like, "No, please. Just tell me something's wrong that I can work on." And eventually I did get more diagnoses and I learned to let them all go, actually, even before I discovered this, because I realized it was all kind of trapping me. I got to the point recently where doing all of that work was something that I knew. It was kind of like getting a diagnosis, but in a more genuine, useful way, because I knew that I was in a crucial part of my story where I knew I had to deal with all this stuff in order to move forward.
Yeah, how did you do that? I mean, you had depression, anxiety, a whole bunch of stuff that was repressed.
Yeah.
In many ways, that's a much bigger mountain to climb than the physical symptoms. How were you able to do that?
Yeah, so I'm kind of a perfectionist, and so what I did
My
was,
neuroplastics patients are very familiar with
yeah,
that.
yeah. So I got 3 different therapists, each with a kind of a different specialty, and I actually work somewhat in mental health myself, so I kind of know how to navigate things. Pretty good at setting it all up, and I I essentially just started to focus on it a lot, and then I was slowly developing kind of ideas around the nervous system, at least in my life, for what impacts how my nervous system functions. Because I realized that my nervous system is just super dysregulated, or however you want to say it. I know it was not in like an optimal state. And I've had a lot of things like I can't really exercise without a lot of symptoms, so I'd have like exercise intolerance and all of these things that I think had a lot to do with how my nervous system functioned. And what I ended up doing was I kind of began to look at things in my environment almost like a video game of power-ups and power-downs, of like things that would power up my nervous system and things that would power it down. And I began to think about how maybe people a lot of times normalize power downs, thinking that they're power ups, thinking that things that you do that feel good or that protect you, giving into a fear, being safe, they feel like they're the right thing to do in the moment, but I think a lot of times they can create the fear pain cycle. So essentially I was doing a lot of therapy, but also focusing a lot on like what is it in my life that could change environmentally that would make a big impact, or what is it. Tried to listen, like you're talking about, or I think we were somewhat getting onto the point of you have to learn to kind of listen to what it's trying to tell you. Like all of these alarms going off in your system are kind of a signal that I began to think, what is it telling me? Like, what am I missing? And what have I not been listening to my entire life? And I dug really deep into all of that, and I then began to do a lot of work on core beliefs that I've had my entire life that are really negative, that are pretty destructive, that I was hiding from, and trying to really uncover who I actually was underneath all the pain.
Yeah,
Actually.
that's critically important. One of the key questions that I try to answer about all my patients is, what did you learn about yourself as a child that isn't true?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's essentially I've always had the idea that something was inherently wrong with me, that I was sick. Probably from age 6, that I just had this idea that I was not healthy, that I was a sick person, and that I was not good enough for the world that I'm in. That I was not a strong, well person. And I think when something gets implemented at such a young age, it's really hard to like change it, on a whim. It's a really deeply rooted thing.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and that's a common denominator in so many of my patients, is that for any of an almost infinite number of reasons, they are made to feel like they are not as good as other kids, or they are not measuring up, or in more extreme cases, that they are worthless pieces of crap. But the bottom line or common denominator is feeling like you are somehow lesser than you should be, or that other people are. To the extent that you can recall, beyond just your illness, what other things might have been involved there. For example, your parents divorced about 10 years after you first became ill. You could have, as a 6-year-old, been picking up on tensions in that relationship, and very common for a 6-year-old in that environment to try to repair that situation, to focus on doing whatever they could to make that situation better. And obviously, as a 6-year-old, you're not going to be able to do anything, but that won't stop a 6-year-old from trying, and it won't stop a 6-year-old from feeling like a failure if they don't succeed.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely had a lot of it I've realized has a lot to do with I've felt sort of isolated since probably 6 years old from the rest of the world. So, not feeling good enough is a big part of it, which I think inherently makes you feel isolated, like you're not a part of anything, and and nobody understands what even the doctors don't understand what's going on. So it comes to a point where you kind of feel like you're completely alone. And I think that craving, I think also to be not alone from a young age probably played a lot with my parents getting divorced, because it kind of made it seem more like my family unit was, not going to be as cohesive. And I think that at the time, I kind of brushed it off. At the time, I had developed this mentality that nothing in the world can hurt me. That's kind of like my coping mechanism I developed probably when I was like 7 or 8. I was like, I'm never going to cry. I'm never going to get angry. I'm never going to get upset at anything. Nothing will ever shake me. The world could explode around me and I'll be fine. That was basically the way I tried to deal with life all the time in order to deal with all the pain and the suffering that I was dealing with.
It suggests to me also that perhaps there were things in addition to your physical symptoms that you were trying to wall yourself off from. I don't know what those were. I don't want to put words in your mouth, obviously, but it does make me wonder about that.
Yeah, it makes me wonder too. I've thought about that a lot. And again, I don't know exactly where it came from, but I think at some point I just got this idea in my head that I was not good enough at a young age. It could have been just hearing or seeing something happening in my family dynamic. I've tried to ask people in my family about it. The only thing I've kind of heard is that I was somewhat underweight. I've been underweight by a lot of metrics throughout my life, which bothered me a lot in my childhood, and added evidence that I wasn't good enough. But I think when I was really small, like young, I might have maybe just even overheard a doctor talking or something, saying that something wasn't quite right with me. And then maybe that coupled with getting sick and just, other things kind of built this deep belief that I was just inherently not good enough.
Yeah, and again, that's very, very common in my patients to have come out of their early years with that belief. And it can play into personality characteristics as well. I mean, a child who feels that way about themselves will sometimes react against that by trying to be perfect. They'll often be very critical of themselves, more critical of themselves than they ever would be of somebody else when they fall short. It can lead into close personal relationships not being well balanced. If you are focused on the needs of other people in your household, for example, you may end up in relationships with people where you also are very focused on their needs or solving their problems, and you get less back from that person than you are giving to them. So that's another one. Not necessarily that you have any of these, but they can be secondary consequences to that primary issue of feeling like you're not good enough.
Yeah, I think family, I look at it as, one thing I think about is, like, if you have a wild animal, like a mouse, living in its mouse environment, and then if you put it in a lab and do tests on it, it's no longer in a mouse environment, so it reacts differently. And that's kind of how I felt a lot of times. I felt like I was in maybe my environment that we normalize. It seemed like everybody kind of just normalizing, like maybe I thought that I was in a normal environment, but really there were things that I needed that I didn't get, or that I would have liked but didn't know how to express it. And so it kind of, when people, would do tests and labs on me and all this stuff, they couldn't find anything wrong because they weren't really looking for, like, they weren't really asking more profound questions.
Right questions, yeah.
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 And
One of the ways that has helped, or techniques that's helped my patients to figure some of this out, is to imagine a child of their own growing up in the same environment. And can you recognize anything that was happening that you would not have wanted for a child of your own? Or if you have a nephew or a niece or some other child that you care about, and imagine them growing up in your household, would there be anything that you would observe in that environment that would make you sad or angry, for example? And sometimes, when we look back at our own lives, we're not seeing things as accurately as we would if we were watching some other child try to cope with the same stuff.
yeah, I've thought about that also. I know that is a good way to look at, to put things in perspective, a good way to look at things. And the thing that it makes me think of is when I was young, I think I experienced what I might call like a lot of passive neglect, or I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but my family never talked about anything really, I feel like. Anything hard. So my life being so hard all the time, regardless of how it got there, definitely strengthened, I think, a lot of, or just didn't allow me to get better. I always felt like I couldn't talk about what was wrong with me, or like what I was going through, and I had to kind of just pretend that it wasn't happening as much as possible. It got to, the best example is I used to run away a lot during those times when I was probably 6 and 7 years old, and I would even threaten to end my life, and I was suicidal at that age a lot when I was really sick and going through a lot of stuff. And I was put into I was sedated and taken away at one point to a mental hospital for about a month. And it was extremely traumatic, that whole experience. And I remember when I got back home, I don't think anybody really in my family ever actually asked me about it, or like talked about it, or was like, was that scary, or what happened, or like, what was it like? I think it was just like, okay, you're back now, let's just go back to normal and just pretend everything's okay. And I think that, for me at least, might have caused a lot of anger that I was deep inside me, like where I was really angry that it felt like nobody wanted to understand me, or could understand me, or they kind of just wanted to pretend that what I was going through wasn't actually worth paying attention to, which I know if, they probably would not have consciously been thinking that, but it's probably how I was feeling a lot. Feeling
That's,
like,
that's the message their behavior was sending.
yeah.
And that is a profound story. That just in 2 minutes there, you captured a ton of issues that, ideally we would be able to unpack a little bit, because you became ill when you were 6, and the illness itself created a feeling of not being good enough. But something had to launch the illness in the first place. Something had to begin that vicious cycle that led to, illness, leading to a feeling of not being good enough, leading to more pressure, leading to more illness. But it doesn't start with the illness. The illness starts with something else in the environment that you were in. And a family that would treat you in the way that they did after you came back from the institution, that's a family that is, they may care a lot, but they're not showing it. And if they were not showing it in those circumstances, they were probably not showing it before you were sent away. And, to be suicidal at age 6, that only happens if there's enormous pressure.
Yeah.
And enormous pressure can come from, as you described, people not talking about what's important, people not, if they do care, but they're not showing it, then as far as the child is concerned, they don't care. And, then that leaves you, especially as you get your symptoms, it leaves you with two choices. Either you're going to talk about your symptoms and get some attention and some caring about them. Or if that doesn't work, if that very healthy approach is not available in your environment, then your other choice is to toughen up and repress it all. And that was the only choice you had.
Yeah.
And that's what you did. For a 6-year-old, that's, for an adult, that's difficult.
Yeah.
For a 6-year-old, it's in that circumstance, it's sadly not surprising that you thought your life was no longer worth living. To be physically ill and also in an environment where there was not sufficient caring about that, and you are left to resort to repression as your only way out, unbelievably difficult. And again, the analogy of the Olympic weightlifter comes to mind, that at age 6, you were carrying Olympic levels of stress.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of all I ever knew. And it's hard going back that far. I also was heavily medicated. I mean, when I went to doctors, in a sense, some of them kind of were on the right path because they said it was all anxiety. They said, oh, it's just anxiety, just take all this medication. Unfortunately, none of my symptoms ever went away, and my mental health only got more complex, and I was also prescribed and diagnosed with ADHD, and then also depression and anxiety, and then essentially I think I lost the ability to kind of feel because of coupled with probably my coping mechanism and all this medication. I remember being at my cousin's funeral when I was like probably 8 or 10, and my whole family was, and he passed away when he was 17, I think, and everyone in my family was, crying and feeling all of this, these terrible feelings of loss. And I remember I couldn't feel anything. I just remember feeling like, why is everybody so sad? Like, I had no ability to feel anything. Like, I had no emotion. I think it's like building a wall that the other side is pain and suffering that numbs you from feeling anything else almost.
Exactly right. Yes. I mean, you don't get the option to take the wall down temporarily when you're at a funeral
Yeah.
and then put it back up as soon as you leave the funeral. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. It took me a long time to really break that wall down. And I think that's still basically the main work that I do or that I've done is kind of trying to focus on. I mean, first I had to basically, when I read the book and made some progress, I feel like I kind of like broke a big part of the wall down and then unleashed what was behind it. And now, like we're talking about it, it's kind of going back to the genesis, which, like I said, is hard because for anyone, it's hard to remember that far back. But
Well,
for me,
especially when you've repressed.
yeah, I mean, I don't remember. So one thing I think about a lot, or I've talked about, is I know that I saw probably maybe 10 different kind of mental health practitioners between age of 6 and 15, and I don't remember a single one of them. I don't remember their face. I don't remember their name or their office or anything. And I know I'd been a psychiatrist, psychologist. I know for a fact the memories are just gone. Like I have no access to them.
And I gather that none of them ever suggested family therapy where they brought your parents into the room and tried to figure out what was going on in the family dynamics.
I don't remember any of that ever being, and it's like kind of like what I was saying, where with your environment, like what we normalize. If you ask someone on the street, do you have a good relationship with your parents? A lot of people would just say, yeah, it's good. But then if you really look at it, it might be not a good relationship. Like we normalize, I think, a lot of poor quality of relationships and things in our environment that probably have a big impact. And because it's normalized, we don't actually look at like what really is the quality of the relationship? Do we ever talk about anything? Do we actually express profound feelings between each other? And I think that's kind of how I changed the way I look at my life now. Is now I'm trying to pay more attention to that, the quality of relationships and the things that really I didn't have when I was really young.
Yeah, no, it's hard for several reasons. I mean, first of all, most of my patients still want to have a good relationship with their parents, or if they don't have one, they would not like to build one if possible, even later on in life. And it's also the case that most of the time the parents are doing the best they can, that they've had their own
Totally.
issues and they are coming from their own sometimes very difficult environments, and they're trying their best. And also when we look back, as I mentioned earlier, we have no parallel life to compare ourselves with. So this is why I come back to that thought experiment of imagine raising a child of your own exactly the way you were raised. If you sent a kid off to a mental health institution where they were medicated and they came back after a month, would you try to ignore that elephant in the room that your kid had just been at this place? Or would you sit down with them and try to get them to share what had happened to them there and how they felt about it? And when people look at it in those terms, they can see that they were carrying a greater burden than they might have realized at first.
Yeah, and the answer is definitely no. I wouldn't. I mean, I would, if I had, one of the reasons why I think I really want to have a family in my life, I want to have kids, so that because I feel like I'm so excited to kind of give them so much compassion and like be able to talk about anything and be there in every way possible. And I feel like my family, like you said, they did the best they could, and they just did what doctors told them a lot of times. They would take me to a doctor. Like, if you have a broken arm, what do you do? So they would say, oh, he's having these problems. What do we do? And, probably it has a lot to do with how their family was when they were young, the way that they interact and what creates our family dynamic. Outside of even just a nuclear, like a small family, if I have kids, I look at it as like how, like I said, relationships, the quality of my environment. It makes me think a lot about how important it is, what I would say is kind of like a power up for your nervous system. Like, how do you interact with other people? And like in the time that we live in with, social media and the internet age and people being so connected, but the most disconnected that they've ever been in a whole nother way. It makes me think a lot about all of that and how I could change my life now to kind of do like if I was, I can't go back and raise myself differently, right? So I'm like, what can I do now to give myself a more richer environment that I maybe didn't have when I was 6 years old or when I was young?
Yeah, that's very important. One of the issues that I commonly mention with my patients, and frankly in this podcast as well, is the concept of self-care, regularly taking time for your own joy. Many of my patients who were working overtime as kids to try to deal with whatever was toxic in their environment, they were so focused on that they never really learned how to play sufficiently. And when we learn to play as kids, we are learning self-care skills. We are learning what we need for our own joy. And many of my patients don't have that in their lives. They are so focused on, practical things or on the needs of others in their world that they don't just set the rest of the world on the shelf for a period of time and just do something that's the moral equivalent of finger paints for a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that's very important. Another is, when you look back and you think about that kid who came back from the institution and wasn't getting the caring and support that they desperately needed, that's, again, another analogy that I make is like being parachuted into the Himalayas at age 7 and having to find your way out, and that you did that. And it is 100% legitimate to give yourself credit for that. The environment you were in wasn't your fault. I'm not blaming your parents either, because very likely they were doing the absolute best that they could.
100%.
But the environment you were in was still, the Himalayas or the Amazon jungle, whatever analogy you like. And it's critically important to recognize, not your fault that you were in that, but tremendously to your credit that you made it through. There are a lot of people who do not have the strength to cope with something like that, and they don't survive. And, you were, despite enormous suffering, were determined to survive, and you've made it a huge way out the other side of all this, which, again, it's essential to give yourself credit for the heroic perseverance that you've showed for 27 years.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that insight. It is, it's definitely not hardwired into me. It's probably the opposite.
I was going to say it's the opposite. What's hardwired in is you suck. You've got pain. You're not as good as other kids. You have to be institutionalized. You have to be medicated. You have to go to therapists, and none of that was your fault. And all of it is to your credit that you persevered through it all. Physical pain, mental pain, 27 plus years. And if I met somebody who had just climbed Mount Everest, and I actually know somebody who's done that, I think of that as a heroic achievement. And what you've done is at least as heroic as that.
Yeah, that's a good perspective.
And it changes a lot of things. It changes the ability to take time for your own joy. It reduces the perfectionism. It changes your relationships with people. It enables you to set boundaries so that you're not as affected by toxicity from other people. A whole lot of positive things flow from that. It's not as emphasized in many forms of psychotherapy, but I've treated over 7,000 people with neuroplastic symptoms, and this concept of flipping your self-image from the negative that you were taught to the very positive that you deserve it's only accurate. It's only shifting to a truthful way of looking at yourself.
Yeah, and I would imagine it plays a big part in allowing you to accept who you are, which I think is probably a big part of this all. A lot of when I talk to people with neuroplastic symptoms, a lot of times the thing we all have in common is the perfectionism for sure, but like the wanting to fix yourself. Like you inherently need to be fixed. And if you don't figure it out, then it's like the worst feeling ever, because if you can't fix yourself, then what's the point? It's kind of like this, you can go down a long road. And unfortunately, outside of kind of the neuroplastic field of how people treat and talk about chronic illness and pain, often I feel like kind of exacerbates that problem of going down, long roads that don't go really anywhere, like toxic mold and Lyme disease and mast cell activation syndrome and all of these things that are extremely complicated to treat, and nobody really understands very well. And I went down that road for so long, so it's almost like feeding that somewhere inside your brain. It's like craving to not actually find an answer, almost to keep you suffering or something. It's like, and you keep feeding it, and so it's impossible to accept your situation. And so like to be able to celebrate yourself, I think probably helps a lot, or celebrate your story and where you've come from and how you get to where you're at, probably can let go some of that burden that you carry of wanting, because it's kind of like, I look at it as almost like, regardless of a religion or whatever, it's almost like you're asking yourself to have the power of a god, to be able to fix and control completely yourself, which is kind of impossible. And so if you can accept, I think it makes a big difference, because you can let go of that huge pressure it's almost like a godlike pressure, like you're expecting so much of yourself.
Yeah, and in fact, all you have to expect is that whenever you're having symptoms, whether they're mental health symptoms or physical symptoms, that they're coming from this weight on your shoulders. And the task is, it's not anything to do with who you are, it's to do with the weight on your shoulders. And that if you can put that weight down,
Yeah.
and it's a learning process to learn how to put it down. But once you do, then all the strength that you have is there to see.
Yeah, I like that. It's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think it's a good way because it's an accurate way. It reflects the journey that you've been on from day one. That you came into this family that had some serious challenges, and you have met those challenges, and you've come out the other end in a remarkably good place.
Yeah, and I feel like it's interesting because I am now at the point where I'm so intimately aware of what's going on that when I think I said earlier, when I do experience something, it's almost comical in a way because it's like so obvious what's going on, Before in my life, if I got really I didn't allow myself to get stressed out. So if I got stressed out or anxious or nervous, I didn't even allow myself to feel it. I would just, I wouldn't allow it. So now I actually feel those things and I can see how they cause, I never would have known this, but before I go on a date, I get physically sick feeling. I'll have my stomach will feel sick. I'll have all of these physical symptoms. My anxiety is very tied to that. But in the past, I was sick all the time, so I wouldn't even be able to notice it, really. I'd just be like, oh, this is just how I'm just always sick. But now I'm so intimately aware of it that I'm like, oh, obviously this isn't because I'm inherently sick. This is obviously so tied to, I'm going on a date and I'm nervous. And then dealing with things that are hard to navigate in life in general, it's so much easier to point to I'm having these symptoms. It's obviously not something structurally wrong with me.
Yeah, now when your brain is talking to you via your body, you can respond.
Yeah.
You know how to communicate back and to understand what your brain is trying to tell you. And that's, a gigantic step on the pathway toward healing from this.
It certainly is.
Well, this has been hugely informative. I can't thank you enough for being willing to share so much of yourself with the viewers today. It's a remarkable story of courage and perseverance on your part that's going to be inspiring to everybody who sees it. Are there any other questions or ideas that you'd want to share before we close?
I guess my last question would be, getting to the point that I'm at, what would be your take on sort of the polishing, I would say. So you get to a point where the worst stuff is gone and I'm kind of at a place now where I think I would never think I would be this well, but I still, have things come and go. When you're in that situation, what are kind of some of the ways you can kind of tie the knot or keep maintaining, it's not a linear, it's sometimes I go backwards a little bit and then I go forward, and I'm kind of in the stage now where I'm trying to figure out how I can kind of polish this experience.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that you are already very good at that.
Yeah.
It's the only question is that it takes time.
Yeah.
You're talking about the first 30 years of your life being in this terrible situation and only healing from it, the last couple of years. And there's a limit to how quickly the human mind can heal itself. But, you've made such enormous progress in just a couple of years and I can tell from listening to you talk about this, the depth of your insight that you have, it's going to serve you well. You're going to continue to make progress. The key thing is to be able to understand what your brain is trying to communicate when you're having a physical or mental health symptom. And you clearly do that. You're able to immediately connect what your body is doing to what's happening in your life. And that's going to continue, and you're going to get more and more insights. I would emphasize carving out a block of time on a regular basis for activity that has no purpose but your own joy. I would set, if you have any toxic people in your life, I would set boundaries around them so that they are not affecting you physically or mentally, because anybody who's been through what you've been through absolutely does not deserve to have such a person still affecting them. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to cut them off completely, but it does mean setting boundaries so that there isn't the toxicity. And then the third major area that I often recommend is that if there are still emotions in there that need to be heard, writing techniques are often good for that. That you can have tremendous amounts of anger, for example, at people that you also care about. And it's perfectly legitimate to have both of those contradictory ideas in your head about the same person at the same time. And many of my patients benefit from writing about that. Exercise that I have many of my patients do is write a letter to one or both parents, not to mail it, just to write it, where they put down every thought and feeling, both good and bad, that they possibly can. And the more of those emotions you put into words, the less they need to be expressed via the body. It can be helpful before you do that exercise, before you write that unmailed letter, to imagine a child of your own growing up exactly as you did, just to refresh your memories accurately of how much you had to cope with, so that that can then go into the letter. And, all of those things, even if you didn't do a single one of them, you're still going to make progress, because you've done absolutely amazing work in the last couple of years, and there's no doubt in my mind it's going to continue.
Well, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate all your insight, and just so grateful for all the work you and anybody else in this field is doing, because it's kind of, I feel like, a revolutionary time, and so I'm so lucky to even be able to speak to you and share my story, so thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it is a revolutionary time, and there are 50 million other people in the United States alone that are struggling with the same condition that you were, and someday they will get the same quality of care as people with organ diseases and structural damage. It's a real social injustice that at this point they are not getting that level of care.